Kia ora everyone, my name is Emily Greenbank. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand, a sociolinguist. And in this presentation, I'm going to be exploring former refugees' navigation of belonging in the New Zealand context, and specifically looking at how that negotiation plays out in discourse or in interaction. So just for some background, for former refugees, navigating a sense of belonging in a new country can be an arduous journey. Unlike voluntary migrants, refugees often have little opportunity for advanced planning or acquisition of useful local knowledge of their eventual resettlement locations. And I approached the idea of negotiating a sense of belonging as something which is a co-construction and interaction. It's a two-way process. So old-timers and newcomers both have roles to play. And it involves making identity claims which are taken up or rejected or ignored. So in today's paper, I'm exploring how former refugees may be using humour or laughter to manage such identity work, particularly as it relates to employability or employable identities. And humour research perhaps isn't a natural home for research about former refugees and struggles with employability, but it's an area that I am exploring. So the data comes from my wider doctoral study exploring former refugees' navigation of employable identities in New Zealand's labour market, which I completed in 2019. I used an interactional sociolinguistic approach which puts language at the heart of social processes. So looking at micro-level discourse features and their connection to wider social capital D discourses to build up a picture of how people do identity work and interaction. And viewing employability as a co-constructed identity which is navigated moment to moment in interaction, and exploring power dynamics and inequality. So I had 5 former refugee participants from 5 different countries. The study had 2 phases. There was semi-structured conversational interviews, which were largely focused on employment and employment search activity, but with lots of deviations basically wherever the conversation took us. The first interviews covered the participants' background and how they came to be in New Zealand, and then also looked at their stories about employment in New Zealand, or lack thereof. And then I had workplace recording following the Language in the Workplace project, which involved one participant wearing a recording device, wearing or carrying a recording device on normal work days and recording normal workplace interaction with 2 residents at the rest home where she worked as a carer, an elder care facility. So that was to look at employable identity in action. So in today's data, I'll be looking at 2 participants. From the interview phase, I'll be looking at Kelly, a Palestinian woman in her mid-30s at the time, who was a single mother of 2 children, and I'll be looking at data from what I've called her narrative of flight, describing how she came to leave Palestine, and Nina from the workplace recording phase, who recorded her morning routines with 2 residents at the rest home where she worked, as I mentioned, a Colombian woman in her early 30s, a mother of 4 children. Okay, so starting off with Kelly here. In general, Kelly presents herself as very confident, powerful, independent, fearless, someone who doesn't put up with being treated badly by anyone, and also as someone who is highly employable based on her qualifications, although this hadn't actually been recognised by the labour market at the time of data collection. She'd been unemployed for some time, but she's not talking about employment here. So her family came to New Zealand when she and her sister were children. Their parents are Palestinian, but they were actually fleeing Kuwait during the first Gulf War. They came here to New Zealand, and then when the girls were teenagers, the family went to Palestine. The girls were told it was for a holiday, but in fact, the family stayed there. The girls were enrolled in school. And Kelly told me she believes it was her mother's intention for them to stay there, for the girls to get married after finishing school, which they did. Kelly somewhat unwillingly, and Kelly described to me a fairly unhappy and controlling marriage. Here she's describing war breaking out in Palestine Israel attacking Palestine, and then going on to describe an unpleasant situation at home. She says they're just killing each other, and then in the same family, like, people just went crazy and started killing each other. And to add to that, Israel wasn't happy that Hamas took control of Gaza Strip, and they started bombing and cutting off cities from each other, little towns from each other. And they closed the borders. You barely find food or anything like that. So my parents left straight away as soon as they won. As soon as they won, my parents saw absolutely nothing. And she laughs. From all of that, they left straight away. They knew, like, this is not good. We're leaving. Bye-bye. She laughs again. And they left. And then my sister followed like 6 months later. I didn't, because my ex was scared that I would leave him, and he knew I was going to leave him. She laughs again. So he's describing pretty bleak conditions here. Families turning on one another, Palestine being bombed, cities being cut off from one another, food shortages, border closures, and then at home feeling trapped by the war and also being controlled and ostensibly trapped by her husband as well. And she repeatedly describes her parents' departure. She says, they left straight away as soon as they won. As soon as they won, my parents saw absolutely nothing. They left straight away. They said, we're leaving. And finally, they left. And so the repetition of this indicates that the incident is significant to Kelly. But her laughter, and it must be said, fairly humorless laughter, mitigates this somewhat. Of course, laughter can be used to conceal loss of face, and it can shift a serious framing of an incident to a less serious one. And if being left by your parents in a war zone could be described so trivially as face-threatening, we can see how Kelly's laughter allows her to brush off the incident as non-serious. And that's also emphasised by this, when she characterises her parents' farewell to her as this flippant bye-bye, which is an extraordinarily casual description of parents leaving their daughter in an unhappy, controlling marriage, not to mention a literal war zone. But her laughter and this flippant phrasing it's placed in such a way that as narrator, she's distanced from these recounted events, and she's able to counteract the threat to her identity as an in-control woman, which may be posed by this narrated abandonment. And we can also see her here describing a scenario in which she's essentially a prisoner of her husband, both in the country and at home. She would have needed his permission, and did need his permission, to leave the country with the children. But again, she laughs, and that has the effect of ridiculing her husband and highlighting the agency that she theoretically would have had in leaving him once out of the country. Again, orienting to her present-day powerful, independent identity. She did eventually leave the country with her children. So, of course, while laughter frequently accompanies humour, laughter and humour are discrete entities, and in this case seems to be being strategically placed to perform an interactional function of framing the preceding content as trivial or foolish. So the content of what Kelly describes is at odds with her identity of strength and independence, and not to mention low tolerance for being treated badly, that she consistently orients to normally. And by reframing the situation in a less serious light, almost as if it were comical, as narrator, she perhaps allows herself to save face within the interaction and reconcile the low agency experiences of Kelly, the protagonist, with the current sense of self as a self-reliant and free woman, not to mention an employable woman in the context of this research interview that she's doing with me in the moment. And having to navigate past periods of low agency and storytelling, of course, is not uncommon for former refugees. And it becomes really salient in discussions of employability, where these ideas around employability, like adaptability, competence, and so forth, they can clash with widely held ideas about what it means to be a refugee, what I've called discourses of refugeehood, that tend to involve themes of trauma, low agency, and vulnerability. Okay, so moving on to Nina. This is a recorded interaction between her And Charlie, a resident of the rest home where she worked, as I said, she reported on her morning rounds, usually when she was bringing coffee to the residents, for example. Nina and Charlie get along well in general. They're quite friendly. In this excerpt, they're discussing a visit to the rest home from a Green Party politician in the lead up to New Zealand's national election, not the last one, the one before. So Charlie says, I went to a meeting in the rec room, which was with a guy from the Green Party. And Nina says, oh, what he offer? And she laughs. Charlie says, well, he offered all sorts of, and then he changed to a really careful, slow speech. He wants people to vote for the Green Party because they're very worried the environment, about the state of the rivers in New Zealand and the water in New Zealand. And basically, they're very keen to see Labour win. Nina says, oh, that's good. But despite being already aware of the politician's visit, Nina indicates this is new information to her with this utterance initial "oh." And then she uses a humorous framing to invite Charlie to continue his story by asking what the politician had to offer. And by using this choice of wording, she frames the politician as bargaining for votes, and she indexes a familiarity with discourses of politics as a morally ambiguous game. And this joke-like framing is supported by her following laughter as well. And it may be an attempt to both create solidarity with Charlie and to make a claim to belonging, emphasizing shared knowledge or drawing on local repertoires to highlight or create solidarity. Charlie doesn't take up the solidarity and identity claim, though he does initially mirror her usage of offer before switching to the slow and carefully pronounced speaking style, and saying that what the visitor wanted was for people to vote for the Green Party. And telling someone that what a visiting Green Party candidate wants is for people to vote for the Green Party is a somewhat obvious and condescending explanation. And it also works to reject both Nina's attempt at humour and her orientation to political insight. But she doesn't give any indication that she takes it as such. She indicates again this is new information, and she gives an evaluation of this new info. And in Charlie's detailed story, which continued in this fashion for some time, along with Nina's receptive feedback throughout, is the effect of co-constructing an expert-novice dichotomy between Charlie and Nina. And also Charlie's marked, slow and careful speech is likely intended to make sure Nina understands, which in my own experience with her isn't necessary, but it emphasizes her status as a non-native speaker of English, positioning her as something of an outsider in addition to a novice. So Nina's doing her job here. She's performing a contextually appropriate employable identity, which involves engaging with residents. As I mentioned, she and Charlie have an amicable relationship. And in this attempt to create solidarity, to seek common ground, to have a conversation as equals, she attempts a joke or at least a humorous framing, and at the same time displays her familiarity with discourses of politics. But Charlie quite effectively demonstrates that humour, of course, is a co-construction and it has to be endorsed by others to be successful. And he ignores, or maybe he doesn't even notice this attempt, and instead attempts to teach Nina about politics. So this fleeting claim to belonging that she's making through in-group humour and knowledge of the discourses instead results in her being positioned as an outsider, as a newcomer. And she continues to orient to her professional identity by accommodating this teaching. So in the excerpts that I've shown today, we've seen laughter used to mitigate or to manage narration of past periods of extreme low agency that seem to be presenting a threat to the storyteller's current sense of self and position in her new life, which hints at the wider discourses of refugeehood and their associations of low agency that former refugees have to contend with as they try to move on with living normal lives generally, and with regards to my research to present themselves as employable specifically. And we've seen an attempt at humour to build solidarity through familiarity with discourses of politics, and show her in-group status, but that humour being rejected and Nina instead being repositioned as an outsider, an out-group member. And again, I think this speaks to those discourses of refugeehood where Charlie's ideas about who Nina is, based on her former refugee status, her second language speaker status, and so forth, impact on their interaction such that her insider knowledge is completely overlooked. So I think what I've shown here, or tried to show here, is the interesting intersection of interactional sociolinguistics and humour for this research area, where we can look at the micro-level discourses, the laughter, the humour, and its connection to moment-to-moment identity and belonging navigation and wider social discourses and ideologies, and the value of humour as a perhaps unexpected lens for looking at this navigation of employability and refugeehood, and of the navigation of the social processes of belonging generally, and how that plays out in interaction. Thank you.